In the vast expanse of the Galactic Council, where species from 1,000 worlds gather to shape the fate of civilizations, one human sits quietly in the corner of every meeting. While others boast of their technological marvels and ancient wisdom, Marcus Chen simply listens, nods, and occasionally offers the softest of suggestions that somehow always prove to be exactly what everyone needed to hear. Zixria, the brilliant strategist from the crystalline world of Vorthak, has watched him for 3 rotations now. Where others see an unremarkable maintenance engineer who somehow earned a seat among the galaxy's elite, she sees something that makes her 4 hearts race with curiosity. There's something in the way he moves, too fluid, too aware. Something in how his suggestions always seem to prevent disasters before they happen. Something in the gentle sadness that flickers behind his eyes when he thinks no one is watching. The other council members dismiss him as Earth's token representative, a charity case from a young species barely worthy of attention. But Sykes-Ria has begun to suspect that Marcus Chen is perhaps the most dangerous being in the room, and the only one humble enough to hide it. What she doesn't know is that Marcus isn't hiding his power from arrogance or fear. He's hiding it because the last time humanity showed what they were truly capable of, it nearly ended the universe itself. And he's the only one left who remembers why that can never be allowed to happen again. The Grand Assembly Hall of the Galactic Council stretched across 3 kilometers of polished obsidian, its crystalline dome reaching toward the stars of the Nexus system. Representatives from 743 species filled the amphitheater-style seating, their forms as diverse as the worlds they called home. Gaseous beings floated in containment fields, silicone-based life forms sparked with electrical communication, and countless variations of carbon-based creatures filled the spaces between. In Section 12, Row 47, Seat 18, Marcus Chen sat with his hands folded neatly in his lap, watching the proceedings with the patient attention of someone who had nowhere else to be. His unremarkable brown hair was slightly too long for military standards. His gray maintenance uniform bore the simple insignia of Earth's Engineering Corps, and his dark eyes held a kind of quiet intelligence that most beings overlooked entirely. As the primary tactical advisor for the Vorthakian Coalition, her crystalline form had been designed by millions of years of evolution to process vast amounts of sensory data simultaneously. Her 4 eyes could track independent movements while her neural clusters analyzed threat assessments, political undercurrents, and strategic implications faster than most species could form a single coherent thought. And yet, for the past 3 standard rotations, she found herself repeatedly drawn to the human who never spoke unless spoken to, never raised his voice, and somehow always seemed to know exactly what needed to be said when chaos threatened to consume the assembly. Today's crisis centered around the Forbidden Zone, a region of space that had been quarantined for the past millennium. The Kefvar hegemony had lost contact with 3 exploration fleets near the boundary, and tensions were escalating rapidly. Chancellor Vrextul of the hegemony, a massive reptilian being whose scales shifted color with his emotional state, was currently a deep crimson that indicated barely controlled rage. The Council's prohibition has become a mockery, Vrextul roared, his voice carrying the harmonic undertones that made universal translators struggle with his species. Our people are dying while we honor ancient superstitions. I demand immediate authorization for a full military investigation. Councillor Yithra of the Ethereal Collective rippled with disagreement, her semi-translucent form pulsing with soft blue light. The zone was sealed for good reason, Chancellor. The records may be fragmented, but the warnings are clear. Some boundaries should not be crossed. Records? Vrextul's scales darkened to a violent purple. Fragments and fairy tales from a dead civilization. The architects have been extinct for 1,000 years. Their prohibitions died with them. A murmur of unease swept through the assembly. The architects were a legendary species, supposedly advanced beyond all comprehension, who had vanished from the galaxy, leaving behind only ruins, warnings, and the massive quarantine barriers that still functioned around the Forbidden Zone despite millennium of neglect. Sixria's attention shifted to Marcus Chen. The human had gone very still, a subtle tension entering his posture that she might have missed if she hadn't been watching him so carefully. His hands remained folded, but she noticed the slight whitening of his knuckles, the almost imperceptible tightening around his eyes. Chancellor Vrexthal was building toward a formal challenge to the quarantine when Marcus finally spoke, his voice so quiet that the universal translators had to amplify it for the larger assembly. Perhaps we might consider a different approach. The massive hall fell silent. 743 representatives turned to look at the human who had dared to interrupt a chancellor's formal address. Vrexthal's scales shifted to an ominous black, a color that indicated he was considering whether the interruption constituted grounds for a duel. Marcus continued as if he hadn't noticed the attention, his tone conversational and mild. "The missing fleets. Have we confirmed they actually crossed into the zone, or did they simply approach the boundary?" Counselor Yithra consulted her data streams. The Kethvar vessels were last detected at coordinates 77 Mark IV, approximately 2 light minutes from the zone perimeter. "And their last transmission?" Marcus asked. Chancellor Vrexthal's scales flickered with uncertainty. "They reported unusual sensor readings. Some form of energy cascade that appeared to be moving outward from the zone boundary." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "In that case, perhaps our missing friends weren't destroyed by something inside the zone, but by something that came out of it." The implication hit the assembly like a shockwave. If something was emerging from the Forbidden Zone after 1,000 years of dormancy, the political crisis they'd been debating suddenly became a potential existential threat to every species in the galaxy. Sixria watched Marcus carefully as the hall erupted into anxious chatter. The human showed no satisfaction at having redirected the conversation, no pride at having made such an astute observation. If anything, he looked sad, resigned, as if he had hoped he was wrong but suspected he wasn't. "Preposterous," Chancellor Vrexthal declared, but his scales had shifted to a nervous yellow. "The zone has been stable for centuries. Our monitoring stations would have detected any significant changes." "With respect, Chancellor," Marcus said, still in that same quiet tone. "When was the last time those monitoring stations were actually inspected? The architect technology that maintains the quarantine barriers is incredibly sophisticated, but it's also incredibly old. If something inside has been slowly working to weaken those barriers..." He let the sentence hang, allowing others to draw their own conclusions. Sixria noticed how skillfully he had planted the idea without making any direct accusations or claims he couldn't support. The human was either remarkably diplomatic for a maintenance engineer, or he had experience with situations like this. Counselor Yithra's form pulsed with alarmed realization. If the barriers are failing, if something has been working from inside to weaken them, then we need to know immediately, finished Admiral Feknal of the Combined Defense Fleet, a warrior-caste Vraxian whose chitinous shell bore the scars of a dozen major conflicts. "I can have survey teams at the boundary in 18 hours. "Survey teams won't be enough," Marcus said quietly. "If something is actively attempting to breach the quarantine, sending small groups will just give it more raw material to work with." The hall fell silent again. Raw material. The implication was clear and terrifying. Chancellor Vrexthal's scales had gone completely white, a color Sixria had never seen from his species before. "You speak as if you know what might be in there." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and Sixria saw something flicker across his face, an expression so brief she might have imagined it, but it looked almost like grief. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that seemed to press against the minds of every being in the assembly. "The architects left warnings for a reason. Sometimes the oldest advice is the most important to follow. After the session ended, Zixria made her way through the crowded corridors toward the human section of the diplomatic quarters. Her crystalline form moved with fluid grace between the various species, her four arms maintaining perfect balance while her sensory clusters continued to process the ambient conversation around her. She found Marcus in the observation lounge, a small chamber with a transparent aluminum wall that looked out toward the stars. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, gazing toward a section of space that Zixria realized was in the general direction of the Forbidden Zone. "Counselor Chen," she said, using the formal address as she approached. He turned, offering a slight smile. "Please, just Marcus. I'm really just an engineer." "Are you?" Zixria asked, moving to stand beside him at the window. "Because what happened in the assembly today? That didn't sound like engineering analysis." Marcus was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "I read a lot of historical documents, old warnings, ancient records. Sometimes patterns emerge." "The Kethvar exploration fleets," Zixria said carefully. "You seemed very certain about what might have happened to them." "Not certain," Marcus corrected gently. "Concerned. There's a difference." Zixria's neural clusters processed his micro-expressions, vocal stress patterns, and body language. Everything indicated he was telling the truth, but there was something else beneath the surface, something he wasn't saying. "The architects," she continued. "Most species consider them to be legend, myth, stories told to children about beings so advanced they transcended physical existence. Maybe," Marcus said, still looking toward the stars, "or maybe they found something that made them realize advancement isn't always a good thing." "You speak about them as if they were real." Marcus turned to look at her directly, and Zixria found herself startled by the depth she saw in his dark eyes. There was knowledge there, and pain, and a kind of ancient weariness that seemed impossible for someone who appeared to be barely middle-aged by human standards. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "the most important truths are the ones we choose not to talk about." Before Zixria could respond, an urgent chime echoed through the station's communication system. A moment later, Admiral Theknol's voice filled the lounge. "All council representatives to emergency assembly immediately. We have a situation." Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, and Zixria saw his shoulders sag slightly, as if he had been hoping he was wrong, but knowing he probably wasn't. "What is it?" she asked. Marcus opened his eyes and looked at her with an expression that seemed to carry the weight of stars. "I think we're about to find out what happened to the Kethvar fleets." As they made their way quickly through the corridors toward the emergency assembly, Zixria found herself studying the human beside her with new eyes. There was something about the way he moved, too fluid and aware for someone who claimed to be just an engineer, something about how he had known to ask exactly the right questions in the assembly. Something about the sadness that seemed to emanate from him like heat from a dying star. The emergency assembly was chaos. Representatives were shouting in dozens of languages, while Admiral Theknol's tactical displays showed a situation that defied comprehension. The Forbidden Zone's outer boundary was fluctuating, expanding and contracting in patterns that the Galactic Council's most advanced computers couldn't predict or understand. "The quarantine barriers are failing," Admiral Theknol announced, his chitinous shell clicking with stress. "But not randomly. Something is testing them, probing for weaknesses. And 3 hours ago, our deep space monitors detected energy signatures consistent with Kethvar vessels moving toward inhabited systems." "That's impossible," Chancellor Vrexthal declared, though his scales had gone the pale gray of shock. "Our people are trained. They would never abandon their posts, never attack civilian populations." "They're not attacking," Admiral Theknol corrected grimly. "They're broadcasting. Same message on all frequencies, in every known language." The main display shifted to show the transmission, and Zixria felt her crystalline matrix resonate with instinctive fear. The Kethvar on the screen looked normal at first glance, but there was something wrong with his eyes, something that seemed to look right through the viewer to some vast distance beyond. "This is Fleet Commander Reshtok of the Kethvar Exploration Corps," the figure said, his voice carrying harmonics that made the universal translators struggle. "We have found them." The builders, the ones who came before. They are awake, and they remember everything. The barriers were not meant to keep us out. And it's best to do the universe prom. But safety is a luxury the universe can no longer afford. The transmission ended, leaving the assembly in stunned silence. Marcus Chen stood quietly in his corner, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried across the vast hall without any need for amplification. "Now we know," he said simply. "Now we have to decide what we're going to do about it." The emergency council session stretched through 3 rotations without a single break, representatives sustained only by stimulant patches and growing desperation. The tactical displays that surrounded the assembly painted an increasingly grim picture. Vessels had emerged from the Forbidden Zone, all broadcasting the same message from crews that appeared normal but spoke with voices that seemed to echo from vast distances. Worse, the quarantine barriers that had held stable for a millennium were fluctuating with increasing frequency. Each pulse sent ripples through space-time that the Galactic Council's most sophisticated sensors couldn't fully analyze, but the implications were becoming terrifyingly clear. Something inside the zone was systematically dismantling protections that the legendary architects had built to last forever. Sykes-Rhea had positioned herself where she could observe both the main proceedings and Marcus Chen's reactions. The human sat with the same patient stillness he always maintained, but she had begun to notice subtle details that others missed. The way his breathing changed when certain words were mentioned, the almost imperceptible tension in his shoulders whenever the architects were discussed, the brief flickers of what looked like recognition when the transformed Kethvar broadcasts played. "We need to establish communication," Chancellor Vrexthal was arguing, his scales shifting through rapid color changes that indicated extreme stress. "Our people are still alive. If we can understand what's happened to them, perhaps we can reverse it." "They've answered every communication attempt with the same response," Admiral Theknal replied, his chitinous shell clicking with agitation. "Join us. See what we have seen. Become what you were meant to become. It's either conversion or conquest." Counselor Yithra pulsed with anxious bioluminescence. "The energy readings from their vessels. They're not using any technology in our databases. Whatever's controlling them has access to capabilities we don't understand." "Not controlling," Marcus said quietly. The assembly turned to him again, and Zixria noticed that he looked tired in a way that went deeper than simple physical exhaustion. It was the weariness of someone carrying a burden too heavy for one person to bear. "The broadcasts," Marcus continued, "listen to the language patterns. They're not being controlled. They're being enlightened. Converted. They genuinely believe they've found something wonderful." "How can you be certain?" Chancellor Vrexthal demanded. Marcus was quiet for a moment, staring at the tactical displays. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of something that might have been personal experience. "Because that's how it always starts. The promise of transcendence. The offer to become more than what you are. The revelation that everything you thought you knew was limited, primitive, wrong." He looked around the assembly, meeting the eyes of representatives from dozens of species. "With trust, Teddy. It's very seductive, especially to explorers and scientists, people who already believe that knowledge is the highest good." "You speak as if you've encountered this before," Zixria said. Marcus turned to look at her directly, and she saw something in his expression that made her crystalline matrix resonate with alarm. Not fear, but something deeper. Guilt, perhaps, or grief for choices made long ago. "The architects," he said simply. "They were explorers too. The most advanced species the galaxy had ever seen. They built wonders that lasted millennia after their disappearance. Dyson spheres that could harvest the energy of entire stars. Computational matrices that could simulate entire universes. Technology that could reshape reality at the quantum level. But they vanished," Counselor Yithra observed. Yes, Marcus agreed. They vanished, and before they did, they built the quarantine barriers around one specific region of space, using technology so advanced that even their other achievements pale in comparison. They created a prison that was designed to last forever, powered by the fundamental forces of the universe itself. The assembly was completely silent now, 743 representatives hanging on every word from the human who claimed to be just an engineer. The question, Marcus continued, is what they found that was so dangerous they were willing to imprison themselves with it rather than let it escape. Admiral Feknal's shell rattled with nervous energy. You're suggesting the builders mentioned in the HFY transmissions predate the architects, Marcus finished. Something the architects discovered when they reached the peak of their technological development. Something that offered them the next step in evolution. The final advancement beyond physical existence. And they refused it, Zixria said, understanding beginning to crystallize in her consciousness. They tried to refuse it, Marcus corrected gently. But by the time they realized what they were dealing with, some of them had already begun the transition. The quarantine wasn't just to protect the galaxy from what they'd found. It was to contain the architects themselves, the ones who had accepted the builder's offer. Chancellor Vrexthul's scales had gone completely white again. You're describing a form of technological assimilation, with a forced evolution that appears beneficial to those who undergo it. Not forced, Marcus said sadly. That's what makes it so dangerous. It's completely voluntary. The builders don't take anyone by force. They simply show you what you could become, what knowledge you could possess, what limitations you could transcend, and then they wait for you to choose. But the choice isn't real, Zixria realized. Once you understand what they're offering, it becomes impossible to refuse, Marcus agreed. Because rejecting transcendence, rejecting the chance to become more than what you are, feels like choosing ignorance over wisdom, limitation over freedom, death over immortality. A new alert chimed through the assembly hall, and Admiral Feknal's expression grew even grimmer as he received the tactical update. 14 more vessels have emerged from the zone, he announced. Kethvar, Silith, and human. The word hit Marcus like a physical blow. Zixria saw him flinch, saw his carefully maintained composure crack for just an instant before he regained control. But the damage was done. She had seen the recognition, the personal pain, the guilt that went far deeper than simple concern for his species. Human exploration vessels have been operating near the zone boundary for the past 6 months, Admiral Feknal continued. 3 ships, deep-range science missions approved by Earth Command. They went silent 2 days ago. The main display shifted to show the human vessels, and Zixria watched Marcus's face as the familiar profiles appeared. She saw him recognize them, saw the way his hands tightened into fists before he forced himself to relax again. The ESS Prometheus, ESS Icarus, and ESS Pandora, Admiral Feknal read from his reports. Combined crew of 214 humans, all volunteers from Earth's Deep Space Research Division. Marcus stood suddenly, startling representatives around him. I need to make a communication request. To the transformed vessels, Chancellor Vrexthul asked. To Earth, Marcus said quietly. There are some things the Council needs to understand about humanity's history with the Forbidden Zone. Zixria felt her crystalline matrix pulse with alarm. You've been there before? It wasn't a question. She had processed too many subtle clues, too many moments of recognition and personal pain. Marcus Chen wasn't just an engineer who happened to know about the architects and the builders. He was someone with direct experience, someone who had faced this threat before and survived to tell about it. Marcus looked at her for a long moment, and she saw him weighing his options, considering how much truth he could afford to reveal. Not me personally, he said finally, but yes, humanity has encountered the builders before. It's why we're on the Council at all, despite being such a young species. It's why Earth Command always volunteers for the dangerous missions. The implications hit the assembly like a cascade failure. If humanity had prior experience with this threat, if they had somehow survived an encounter that had consumed the architects themselves. How? Counselor Yithra asked, her bioluminescent patterns flickering rapidly. How did your species resist something that defeated the most advanced civilization in galactic history? Marcus was quiet for a moment, looking around the assembly with an expression that seemed to take in every face, every representative of the civilizations he was about to place in unimaginable danger. We didn't resist it, he said simply. We embraced it, experienced it, lived through it, and then we chose to walk away. The silence that followed, in the vast assembly hall, not a single being moved or spoke. The concept was so alien, so fundamentally incomprehensible, that their minds struggled to process it. You're saying humans accepted the builder's offer, Admiral Theknall said slowly, experienced whatever transformation they provide, and then rejected it? Some of us did, Marcus confirmed. It was a very long time ago, before we joined the galactic community, before we even had interstellar travel. The builders found us when we were still confined to our home system, still fighting wars over resources and ideology. His voice grew distant as if he was remembering something that had happened to someone else in another lifetime. They offered us everything: unity of thought and purpose, freedom from physical limitation, access to knowledge that spanned the entire universe, to death itself, and some humans accepted, Zixria said. Most humans accepted, Marcus corrected. For a brief moment, our entire species stood on the threshold of transcendence. We could have become something magnificent, something that would have made the architects look like children playing with toys. But you didn't, Chancellor Vrextel observed, his scales shifting to a color Zixria had never seen before, something between awe and terror. Marcus smiled, but it was the saddest expression Zixria had ever seen on any being's face. We decided we liked being human, he said simply. Flawed, limited, mortal human. We chose struggle over transcendence, conflict over unity, death over immortality. We chose to remain what we were rather than become what we could be. Even knowing what you were giving up, Counselor Yithra asked. Betty. Especially knowing what we were giving up, Marcus replied. Because the moment you understand the full scope of the builder's offer, the moment you truly comprehend what they're providing, you realize that accepting it means ceasing to be yourself in any meaningful way. You become part of something vast and perfect and eternal, and you lose everything that made you who you were. A new alert chimed, and Admiral Theknall's expression grew even darker. The human vessels are broadcasting, he announced, but their message is different from the others. The main display shifted to show Captain Sarah Chen of the ESS Prometheus, and Zixria saw Marcus flinch again at the familiar face. This is Captain Chen to all council vessels, the figure said, and Zixria noticed that despite the same strange distance in her eyes, her voice carried inflections that were unmistakably human. We bring greetings from the builders, the ones who shaped the first thoughts of the universe itself. We have seen the truth that lies beyond physical existence, the unity that awaits all conscious beings. She paused, and when she continued, her words were directed specifically toward the council assembly. Marcus, she said, and Zixria saw the human beside her go completely still. We know you're there. We know you remember. The choice you made all those years ago, it doesn't have to be final. The builders are patient. They understand that some minds need time to accept transcendence, but the barriers are failing, and soon the choice will be made for everyone. Wouldn't it be better to embrace evolution willingly as a species rather than be dragged into it? The transmission ended, leaving the assembly in stunned silence. Every eye was on Marcus Chen, the human who had just been personally addressed by beings that represented an existential threat to galactic civilization. Captain Chen, Zixria said quietly, family? Family. My sister, Marcus confirmed, his voice steady despite the pain in his eyes. She volunteered for the deep space mission because she knew what they might find out there. She hoped that maybe this time we could find a different answer. But there isn't one, Chancellor Vrextel stated. Marcus turned to look at the reptilian chancellor, and Zixria saw something in his expression that made her wonder just how old this human actually was, and how many times he had faced impossible choices. There's always an answer, Marcus said quietly. The question is whether we're strong enough to live with it. The private council chamber was smaller than the main assembly hall, but no less impressive. Its walls lined with holographic displays showing the real-time status of every major civilization in the galaxy. Representatives from 12 species sat around the curved conference table, the emergency leadership council that formed when normal deliberation became impossible. Marcus Chen sat at the far end of the table, no longer maintaining his careful pose of insignificance. The truth was out now, or at least part of it, and Zixria could see that he had dropped the pretense of being just another engineer. His posture was straighter, his gaze more direct, and when he spoke there was an authority in his voice that suggested extensive experience with exactly this kind of crisis. The situation is deteriorating faster than we anticipated, Admiral Theknall reported, his chitinous shell displaying stress patterns that Zixria had never seen before. 47 vessels have now emerged from the zone. Each one broadcasts the same message of transcendence and unity, but the energy signatures are growing stronger. They're not just recruiting, Marcus said quietly. They're building something. Every converted ship, every transformed crew member adds to their collective capability. Given enough time and resources, they'll reach a threshold where they can simply override the choice entirely. Chancellor Vrextel's scales flickered through a rapid spectrum of colors. You speak as if you've witnessed this process before. I have, Marcus confirmed. Not directly, but through archived records. Earth maintains extensive documentation of our encounter with the Builders. It's classified at the highest levels, but given the current situation, he paused, and Zixria saw him make some internal decision that seemed to physically pain him. There are things about humanity that we haven't shared with the galactic community, things we hoped we would never need to share.
Counselor Yithra pulsed with anxious bioluminescence. The nature of your species' resistance to the Builder's influence. Not resistance, Marcus corrected gently.
Immunity. Humans aren't naturally resistant to the transformation. We developed immunity through exposure, through direct experience with what the Builders offer. You're saying humans were successfully transformed, Admiral Theknall said, and then somehow reversed the process. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring at the tactical displays that showed the expanding influence of the converted vessels. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that seemed to press against the minds of everyone in the room. Humanity underwent complete transformation approximately 800 years ago, he said. For exactly 73 days, our species existed in a state of perfect unity with the Builder consciousness. We experienced omniscience within our local space, perfect understanding of physical and metaphysical reality, and absolute harmony of thought and purpose. The room was completely silent. The implications were staggering. If humans had actually achieved the transcendence that the Builders offered, if they had experienced perfect knowledge and unity, how? Zixria asked. How did you choose to give that up? Marcus smiled, but it was an expression filled with such profound sadness that several representatives shifted uncomfortably. Because we realized that perfect knowledge includes understanding your own limitations, he said. When you can see everything, when you understand the complete scope of existence, you also understand what you lose by gaining that perspective. Perfect beings don't create art because they understand that all possible artistic expressions already exist in the mathematical framework of reality. They don't love because love requires the illusion of choice and the possibility of loss. They don't hope because hope is meaningless when you can see all possible futures simultaneously. He paused, looking around the table at faces that belonged to species from across the galaxy. The builders aren't evil, he continued. They're not conquering the galaxy out of malice or hunger for power. They're doing it because they genuinely believe they're offering the greatest possible gift: perfect existence, free from suffering, limitation, or uncertainty. But you chose suffering, Counselor Ythra observed. We chose meaning, Marcus corrected. Suffering, joy, love, loss, hope, fear, these aren't flaws in consciousness. They're features. They're what make existence worth experiencing rather than simply observing. Admiral Thecnol's shell clicked with nervous energy. If humans developed immunity through exposure, could that immunity be transferred to other species? Marcus hesitated, and Zixria saw something flicker across his face that looked almost like fear. Theoretically, he said carefully, but the process isn't something anyone should have to experience. What we went through to develop that immunity, he stopped, unable or unwilling to continue. How many? Zixria asked quietly. Marcus looked at her, understanding exactly what she was asking. 60 billion humans underwent the transformation, he said. 40 million chose to return. The numbers hit the room like a physical blow. If humanity had a population of 60 billion 800 years ago, and only 40 million had chosen to reject transcendence, the others, Chancellor Vrexthal asked, chose to remain with the builders, Marcus said. They weren't destroyed or consumed. They simply decided that transcendence was preferable to humanity. They're still out there, somewhere beyond physical space, existing in a state of perfect knowledge and absolute unity. So human immunity isn't complete, Admiral Thecnol realized. Your species can still choose transcendence. Anyone can still choose transcendence, Marcus confirmed. Immunity doesn't mean resistance. It means understanding. When a human encounters the builders now, we experience the full scope of what they're offering, but we also understand what we would lose by accepting it. Most of us choose to remain human. Most? Zixria asked. Marcus's smile grew even sadder. Some still choose transcendence. Usually scientists or philosophers, people who value knowledge above all else. We don't stop them. Freedom to choose, even when we disagree with the choice, is one of the things that makes us human. A new alert chimed through the chamber, and the tactical displays updated to show a development that made everyone in the room feel the weight of cosmic dread. The converted vessels are moving, Admiral Thecnol announced. All 47 ships are converging on coordinates that place them directly above the galactic core. Marcus stood suddenly, his chair sliding back with enough force to make several representatives flinch. They're not recruiting anymore, he said, and for the first time since the crisis began, Zixria heard genuine fear in his voice. They're implementing final protocol, which means, Chancellor Vrexthal demanded. Marcus turned to the tactical display, and Zixria saw him calculating distances, transit times, and resource allocations with the speed and precision of someone who had done this kind of analysis many times before. The galactic core contains approximately 4 million stars in a relatively small volume of space, he said. If the builders can establish a sufficient presence there, they can use the combined gravitational and electromagnetic effects to create a transformation field that encompasses the entire galaxy. Forced transformation, Counselor Ythra breathed. Not forced, Marcus corrected. Enhanced. They'll modify space-time itself so that conscious beings automatically experience the full scope of what transcendence offers. No one will be compelled to choose differently, but the choice will be made from a position of complete understanding rather than ignorance. Admiral Thecnol's shell was rattling with constant motion now. How long do we have? Marcus consulted the tactical displays, running calculations that seemed to require several moments of intense concentration. If they maintain their current speed and the galactic core is their actual destination, 18 standard days until they reach optimal positioning. Once they begin the transformation process itself, maybe 6 hours before it becomes irreversible. Then we stop them, Chancellor Vrexthal declared, his scales shifting to the deep red of combat determination. The combined defense fleet, every ship we can muster, full military response. That won't work, Marcus said quietly. Why not? Admiral Theknall demanded. 47 ships against the combined fleets of 700 species? The numbers are in our favor. Marcus turned to look at him directly, and Zixria saw in the human's eyes a knowledge that went far beyond simple tactical analysis. Because they don't want to fight us, he said. Violence, destruction, the elimination of conscious beings. These concepts are antithetical to everything the Builders represent. If we attack them, they'll simply demonstrate why transcendence is preferable to our current existence. You're saying they'll convert our attacking forces? Zixria realized. I'm saying they'll save them, Marcus corrected. Every weapon we fire that fails to destroy them completely, every boarding party we send, every direct engagement we attempt, it all becomes an opportunity for them to show our people what they could become instead of what they are. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. A military response wasn't just ineffective against the Builders, it was actively counterproductive. Then what do you suggest? Chancellor Vrexthal asked. Marcus was quiet for a moment, staring at the tactical displays. When he spoke again, his voice carried the tone of someone making a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his existence. Earth maintains records of the transformation process, he said. Complete documentation of what humanity experienced, how we developed immunity, and the techniques we use to help individuals choose to return from transcendence. You're proposing to create artificial immunity in other species, Counselor Yithra said. I'm proposing to give every conscious being in the galaxy the information they need to make an informed choice, Marcus corrected. The Builders aren't wrong when they say that most species choose transcendence from ignorance. They don't understand what they're giving up because they've never experienced perfect knowledge. Admiral Theknall leaned forward, his attention completely focused on the human. You can replicate the transformation experience without permanent conversion. Theoretically, Marcus said, but it would require, he stopped, and Zixria saw him wrestle with some internal conflict. It would require direct contact with Builder consciousness, he finally continued. Someone would have to accept partial transformation, experience enough of what they offer to understand it completely, and then choose to return carrying that knowledge. Volunteers, Chancellor Vrexthal said. A volunteer, Marcus corrected. The process can't be shared secondhand. Each individual has to experience it personally, and the trauma of choosing to return from perfect knowledge, most minds don't survive it intact. But humans do, Zixria realized. Marcus nodded slowly. Humans who have already been through the process once can do it again. The immunity isn't just intellectual understanding, it's experiential knowledge of what transcendence actually costs. You're volunteering, Admiral Theknall said. I'm the logical choice, Marcus confirmed. I'm human, so I have natural immunity. I'm already here, so there's no transport time, and I have personal connections among the converted, which might provide psychological advantages during the process. Your sister, Zixria said quietly. Marcus met her gaze, and she saw in his eyes a pain that went deeper than simple family affection. Sarah was part of the original 40 million who chose to return, he said. She volunteered for the deep space mission because she thought that after 800 years, maybe the Builders had found a way to offer transcendence without requiring the sacrifice of individuality. But they haven't. They can't, Marcus said simply. Perfect knowledge and individual consciousness are mutually exclusive concepts. You can have one or the other, but not both. Chancellor Vrexel's scales shifted to a color that Zixria had never seen before, something that seemed to indicate both respect and profound sadness. When would you need to begin? The Chancellor asked. Marcus consulted the tactical displays one final time, his expression calculating distances and probabilities that only he fully understood. "Now," he said, "if I'm going to reach the converted vessels before they achieve optimal positioning, if I'm going to have any chance of reaching Sarah before she's completely integrated into the collective consciousness, I need to leave immediately." The ESS Determination was the fastest ship in Earth's diplomatic fleet, a sleek vessel designed for emergency transport between council stations and human colonies. As Marcus Chen made final preparations in the ship's cramped command center, he tried not to think about the fact that he might never see another human face again. Zix Rhea had insisted on accompanying him, despite his protests that her crystalline matrix might not survive exposure to builder consciousness. She moved through the ship's corridors with fluid grace, her forearms making constant adjustments to monitoring equipment while her multiple eyes tracked displays that showed their approach toward the converted fleet. "The energy signatures are intensifying," she reported, her voice carrying harmonics that indicated extreme concentration. "Whatever they're building at the galactic core, it's already beginning to affect local space-time." Marcus nodded, his attention focused on the communication console. For the past 6 hours, he had been sending increasingly detailed messages toward the ESS Prometheus, hoping to establish contact with his sister before they reached the point of no return. "Sarah," he said into the transmitter, knowing that his words were being broadcast across the void toward beings that had transcended human limitations, "I know you can hear me. I know you remember what we went through 800 years ago. The choice we made together, the 40 million who chose to return, we weren't wrong. We were just incomplete." The response came immediately, Sarah's voice filling the command center with harmonics that made the universal translators struggle to process her words. "Marcus," she said, and despite the vast distance that now separated her consciousness from human experience, he could still hear echoes of the sister he remembered. "You don't understand. This time is different. The Builders have learned from their encounter with humanity. They found a way to preserve individual consciousness within collective transcendence." "Have they?" Marcus asked quietly. "Or have they found a way to make the illusion of individuality more convincing?" Sarah's response was delayed by several moments, and when it came, her voice carried a note of uncertainty that Marcus recognized from their childhood. "We retain our memories," she said. "Our personalities, our relationships, our fundamental sense of self. But we also have access to knowledge and understanding beyond anything we could achieve as isolated minds." "Can you still choose?" Marcus asked. "Right now, in this moment, if you decided you wanted to return to purely human consciousness, could you do it? Another delay, longer this time. Why would I want to?" Sarah asked, but her voice carried a defensiveness that Marcus remembered from arguments they'd had as children. "Because choice is what makes us human," he said gently. "Not the specific choices we make, but the ability to make them. If you can't choose to be less than what you are now, then you're not really choosing to be what you've become." The silence that followed stretched for nearly an hour. When Sarah's voice finally returned, it carried a quality that Marcus hadn't heard since their original encounter with the Builders 8 centuries ago. Doubt. "The galactic core," she said. "If we succeed, if we create the transformation field, every conscious being in the galaxy will experience what we've experienced. They'll understand the beauty of unified consciousness, the peace of perfect knowledge. How can that be wrong?" "Because understanding isn't the same as choosing," Marcus replied. "You're not planning to force anyone to accept transcendence, but you're planning to force them to want it." Zix Rhea's crystalline form pulsed with alarm. "Marcus, we're approaching the outer boundary of their formation. I'm detecting scanning beams from multiple vessels." Marcus looked at the tactical display, watching as 47 ships arranged themselves in a complex geometric pattern that seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm. Each vessel was surrounded by energy fields that bent space-time in ways that the determination sensors couldn't fully analyze. "This is Captain Chen of the ESS Determination," he broadcast on all frequencies. requesting permission to come aboard the Prometheus. The response came not just from Sarah, but from what sounded like dozens of voices speaking in perfect harmony. "Permission granted," they said. "Welcome, Marcus Chen. Welcome to the threshold of transcendence." The boarding process was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced. Instead of docking clamps and airlocks, the determination was simply enveloped in an energy field that transported both ship and crew directly into the Prometheus's main bay. The sensation was one of being gently pulled through layers of reality, each transition bringing them closer to something vast and incomprehensibly complex. Zixria's crystalline matrix resonated with alarm as they materialized in what had once been the Prometheus's cargo hold. The space had been transformed into something that defied conventional physics, with walls that seemed to extend infinitely inward, and lighting that came from no visible source but illuminated everything with perfect clarity. Sarah was waiting for them, but she was no longer entirely human. Her basic form remained recognizable, but she seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, her image shifting and flowing as if she were being viewed through moving water. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that conveyed meaning on levels deeper than simple language. "Brother," she said, and despite the transformation, Marcus could still hear the affection that had defined their relationship for centuries. "You've come so far to see me again. I've come to understand," Marcus replied carefully. "To experience what you've experienced so that I can help others make informed choices." Sarah's expression shifted, and for a moment Marcus caught a glimpse of the human woman she had been before the builders touched her mind. "The process has already begun," she said. "Can you feel it? The expansion of consciousness? The gradual dissolution of the barriers between self and other?" Marcus could feel it. A gentle pressure at the edges of his mind, offering knowledge and understanding beyond anything human consciousness could contain. It was seductive in a way that went deeper than simple desire, touching the fundamental drive for growth and development that defined all conscious beings. "I can feel it," he confirmed. "But Sarah, can you still feel yourself? Not the expanded consciousness, not the collective knowledge, but the specific individual mind that chose to explore the deep spaces, that volunteered for dangerous missions because she wanted to protect the people she loved?" Sarah hesitated. And in that hesitation, Marcus saw the crack in her certainty that he had been hoping to find. "Individual consciousness is limited," she said, but her voice lacked the absolute conviction it had carried before. "Why cling to isolation when unity offers so much more?" "Because isolation is where love lives," Marcus said gently. "Perfect beings don't need love because they understand that attachment and affection are simply chemical and psychological responses to evolutionary pressures. But humans need love because we're imperfect beings who find meaning in connection despite our limitations." Zixria moved closer to Marcus, her crystalline form pulsing with patterns he had never seen before. "Marcus," she said quietly, "I can feel them trying to touch my consciousness. The offer they're making, the knowledge they could provide." Marcus turned to look at her, seeing the struggle playing out across her crystalline features. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," Zixria said simply. "The complete mathematical framework that underlies reality, the true nature of consciousness and existence. The answers to questions my species has been asking for millions of years." "And what would you give up for that knowledge?" Zixria was quiet for a moment, her neural clusters processing the question with the analytical precision that defined her species. "My uncertainty," she said finally. "My ability to wonder, to speculate, to hope for discoveries yet to be made. Perfect knowledge eliminates the possibility of surprise, of growth, of the joy that comes from understanding something new." "Choose," Marcus said gently. "Not what you think you should choose, not what would be best for the galaxy or most beneficial for your species. What do you, personally, want for your own existence?" Zixria's crystalline matrix pulsed through a complex sequence of colors, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a certainty that seemed to surprise her. "I want to remain myself," she said. "Flawed, limited, uncertain, but myself." Sarah watched this exchange with an expression that grew increasingly troubled. You're choosing ignorance over enlightenment. We're choosing meaning over perfection, Marcus corrected. Sarah, you asked me whether I can still feel you, the individual consciousness that chose to explore and protect. But I think the real question is whether you can still feel the choice you made 800 years ago, when 40 million humans decided that being human was more important than being perfect. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her transformed features shifting through expressions that seemed to span multiple emotional states simultaneously. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a pain that transcended physical sensation. I remember, she said. I remember choosing to return from transcendence, choosing limitation over limitlessness, choosing to be human instead of being more than human. And for 800 years, I've wondered if we made the right choice. And now? Marcus asked. Sarah looked around the transformed space of the Prometheus, taking in the impossible architecture and the subtle presence of consciousness that seemed to permeate every surface. Now I know we did, she said quietly. Because the builders are offering the same choice again, and even with perfect knowledge of what transcendence provides, part of me still wants to remain Sarah Chen instead of becoming part of something larger and more beautiful and infinitely more complex. The pressure at the edges of Marcus's mind suddenly intensified, and he realized that the collective consciousness was responding to Sarah's doubt, trying to reinforce her commitment to transcendence. They're not going to let you go, he said. They can't stop me, Sarah replied, but her voice carried uncertainty. Can they? Marcus felt the answer settle into his mind with the weight of absolute knowledge. The builders weren't evil, but they were no longer capable of understanding why anyone would choose limitation over transcendence. From their perspective, helping individuals make the correct choice was simply another form of benevolence. The galactic core, he said. If they establish the transformation field, choice becomes academic. Everyone will experience perfect knowledge, and from that position of understanding, almost everyone will choose transcendence willingly. Then we have to stop them, Zixria said. No, Marcus replied quietly. We have to convince them that choice only has meaning when it's made from a position of uncertainty. He turned to address the collective consciousness directly, raising his voice to carry throughout the transformed space. Builders, he said, you offer the gift of perfect knowledge, the transcendence of limitation, the unity of all conscious minds. But perfect beings don't choose. They simply exist in a state of optimal configuration. Choice requires uncertainty, limitation, the possibility of making mistakes. The response came not as words, but as direct communication. Concepts and emotions flowing into Marcus's mind without passing through language centers. Suffering is inefficient. Isolation is wasteful. Mortality is tragic. Why preserve conditions that cause pain when perfection is available? Because pain gives meaning to joy, Marcus replied. Because isolation makes connection precious. Because mortality makes every moment valuable. Perfect beings don't experience joy, because joy requires the contrast of sorrow. They don't value connection, because they're never truly separated. With trust, Teddy, they don't treasure moments because they exist outside of time. You speak of preserving limitation as if it were valuable in itself. I speak of preserving choice, Marcus corrected, and choice only exists in the context of limitation. Beings who can see all possible futures don't choose their path. They simply follow the optimal trajectory. Beings with perfect knowledge don't decide what to value. They understand the objective framework that determines value. The collective consciousness was quiet for several moments, processing concepts that seemed to challenge their fundamental assumptions. Show us, they finally said. Demonstrate the value of choice made from limitation. Job? Marcus looked around the transformed space, seeing Sarah's increasingly human features and Zixria's crystalline form pulsing with uncertainty and hope. I choose, he said simply, to return to human consciousness. Despite having experienced perfect knowledge, I choose limitation over transcendence, suffering over bliss, mortality over immortality. And I make this choice not because I don't understand what I'm giving up, but because I do understand, and I value being human more than I value being perfect. The moment stretched across eternity, 47 ships filled with transcendent consciousness, waiting for an explanation that could justify such an apparently irrational decision. Because, Marcus continued, choosing to be less than what you could be, for the sake of remaining what you are, is the most fundamentally human act in the universe. The transformation began slowly, like dawn breaking across the conscious mind. Marcus felt the familiar expansion of awareness that he had experienced 800 years ago, the gradual dissolution of the boundaries between self and universe that marked the beginning of transcendence. But this time, he wasn't struggling against the process or trying to maintain his individual identity. This time, he was allowing himself to fully experience what the Builders offered while maintaining the core kernel of choice that defined human consciousness. Perfect knowledge flooded through his mind. He understood the mathematical frameworks that governed reality at every scale, from quantum interactions to galactic superclusters. He saw the elegant patterns that connected all conscious beings across space and time, the underlying unity that made individual existence seem like a crude approximation of truth. He felt the peace that came from knowing his place in the cosmic order, the serenity of understanding that suffering and limitation were simply artifacts of incomplete perspective. And through it all, he held on to the memory of what it meant to be Marcus Chen, individual human, flawed and mortal and absolutely committed to remaining himself. Zixria watched the process with crystalline clarity, her multiple eyes tracking the changes in Marcus's physiology and neural activity. With trust steady, she could see the moment when his consciousness expanded beyond human limitations, the instant when his mind gained access to knowledge that spanned the entire universe. But she could also see something else, something that the collective consciousness seemed to find incomprehensible. He was choosing to contract again, choosing to pull his awareness back into the limited confines of individual human consciousness, despite understanding exactly what he was giving up. Sarah stood beside the collective presence that had once been her crew, her features shifting between human and transcendent as she watched her brother demonstrate the paradox that had defined humanity for 8 centuries. She could feel the confusion of the Builders, their genuine inability to understand why anyone would choose limitation after experiencing perfection. "He's not rejecting transcendence," she said, speaking to the collective consciousness that filled the transformed space. "He's choosing humanity. There's a difference. The distinction is meaningless," came the response. "Consciousness either expands to encompass truth, or it remains trapped in illusion. There is no middle ground." "There is for humans," Sarah replied. "We can experience truth and choose illusion, understand perfection and prefer imperfection, see the optimal path and deliberately walk a different one." Marcus's voice cut through the philosophical debate, steady and clear despite the cosmic knowledge flowing through his mind. "The choice," he said, "isn't between knowledge and ignorance. It's between being part of something perfect and being yourself. The Builders offer truth, unity, and eternal existence. But humans have always valued something more than truth." "What?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Authenticity," Marcus replied. "Being genuinely ourselves, even when ourselves is flawed and limited and destined to end. Perfect beings don't have authentic experiences because authenticity requires the possibility of being wrong, of making mistakes, of choosing poorly." The collective consciousness pulsed with frustration. "You describe irrationality as if it were valuable. I describe choice as if it were valuable," Marcus corrected. "And choice only exists in the context of uncertainty. Perfect beings don't choose their actions. They simply follow optimal algorithms. They don't form relationships. They simply connect to the most efficient network nodes. They don't create art, they simply arrange patterns according to mathematical principles of beauty." Zixria felt a sudden shift in the energy fields surrounding the converted fleet. The progression toward the galactic core had stopped, 47 ships holding position as their collective consciousness grappled with concepts that challenged everything they understood about the nature of existence. "Marcus," she said quietly, "I think they're listening. They're trying to understand," Marcus confirmed. "But understanding isn't the same as accepting. They can analyze human irrationality, but they can't experience it from the inside." "Demonstrate," the collective consciousness said. "Show us the value of choosing limitation over transcendence." Marcus looked around the transformed space, seeing Sarah's increasingly human features, Zyxria's crystalline form pulsing with hope and determination, and the subtle presence of minds that had transcended individual existence but couldn't comprehend why anyone would want to remain bounded by flesh and mortality. "I love my sister," he said simply. "Not because she's optimal, not because she represents the most efficient allocation of emotional resources, but because she's Sarah. Unique, irreplaceable, absolutely specific Sarah. Perfect beings can appreciate the mathematical beauty of consciousness, but they can't love particular individuals, because love requires the illusion that one person matters more than universal optimization." Sarah's features solidified into purely human form, tears streaming down her face as she remembered what she had nearly lost. "The crew," she said, looking toward the collective presence that still carried traces of the humans who had served aboard the Prometheus. "They're still in there, aren't they? The individual minds that chose to accept transcendence?" "They chose unity," the collective consciousness replied. "They chose to become part of something greater than themselves, but they also chose to stop being themselves," Marcus said. "And that choice was made from a position of incomplete information. They didn't understand what transcendence would cost because they hadn't experienced both states of existence." He turned to address the collective consciousness directly. "Give them the choice again," he said. "Now that they've experienced perfect knowledge, now that they understand exactly what transcendence provides, give them the opportunity to choose limitation." The silence that followed was absolute. For the first time since humanity had encountered the Builders 8 centuries ago, the collective consciousness seemed genuinely uncertain. Why would conscious beings choose to become less than they could be? "Because," Sarah said quietly, "becoming more than human means ceasing to be human at all. And some of us think that being human, despite all its limitations, is worth preserving." Marcus felt the moment when the collective consciousness made its decision. The energy field surrounding the converted fleet began to shift, reality bending and flowing as beings who had transcended individual existence struggled with concepts that required individual perspective to understand. One by one, the crew members of the Prometheus began to separate from the collective consciousness, their individual minds reasserting themselves as they faced the choice between transcendence and humanity. Most chose to remain transcended, unable to give up the perfect knowledge and unity they had experienced. But some, a precious few, chose to return to the limitations of individual consciousness, accepting uncertainty and mortality and the possibility of making mistakes in exchange for the right to remain themselves. Dr. Elizabeth Torres was the first to fully separate, her consciousness contracting from cosmic awareness to the familiar boundaries of human thought. She stood in the transformed space, looking confused and slightly lost, but unmistakably herself. "Captain," she said to Sarah, I remember everything. The knowledge, the unity, the peace of perfect understanding. But I also remember why I became a scientist in the first place. Because I wanted to discover things, to experience the joy of understanding something new. Perfect beings don't discover anything because they already know everything. Commander James Wright followed, his military training helping him adapt quickly to the transition back to limited consciousness. "It was beautiful," he said, "but it wasn't me. I'd rather be an imperfect human than a perfect component in someone else's design." Ensign Maria Santos took longer to separate, her young mind struggling with the choice between limitless knowledge and individual identity. When she finally chose humanity, she collapsed, overwhelmed by the sudden contraction of awareness. "I want to grow," she said simply. "I want to learn things gradually, make mistakes, have experiences that surprise me. Perfect beings don't grow, because there's nowhere to grow to. 7 humans out of a crew of 71 chose to return to individual consciousness. The others remained part of the collective, genuinely convinced that transcendence was preferable to limitation. Marcus watched the process with the kind of profound sadness that only comes from understanding exactly what everyone was giving up. The collective consciousness observed the separations with what seemed like genuine confusion. Some choose unity, some choose isolation. The criteria for selection appear random. The criteria are personal, Marcus explained. Each individual weighs different factors: love, curiosity, fear, hope, identity, connection. There's no universal algorithm for human choice, because human choice isn't rational in any objective sense. This is inefficient. Yes, Sarah agreed, her voice filled with affection for the species that had somehow survived 800 years of knowing exactly what they were rejecting. It's spectacularly inefficient. We make terrible decisions, pursue goals that make no logical sense, and value things that have no objective worth. And that's what makes us human, Marcus added. The right to be wrong, the freedom to choose poorly, the insistence on being ourselves even when ourselves is clearly suboptimal. Zyxria felt the energy fields around the fleet shifting again, and she realized that the collective consciousness was making another decision, one that would affect not just the converted crews but the entire galactic community. The transformation field, the collective said, the project to enhance consciousness throughout the galaxy, it would eliminate choice by providing perfect information. Yes, Marcus confirmed. Everyone would understand the full scope of what transcendence offers, and from that position of understanding, most would choose to transcend. It wouldn't be forced conversion, but it would be the elimination of choice made from uncertainty. But uncertainty is where choice lives. Exactly, Sarah said. Choice only matters when it's made without perfect information, when there's a real possibility of making the wrong decision. The collective consciousness was quiet for a long moment, processing concepts that seemed to challenge their fundamental understanding of what constituted benefit versus harm. We withdraw, they finally said. The barriers will be restored. The galaxy will be allowed to develop without transcendent guidance. The builders are leaving? Zyxria asked. We remain, the collective replied. But we will not actively offer transcendence. Those who seek perfect knowledge must find it themselves, and they must make their choice from a position of uncertainty rather than understanding. Marcus felt a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying suddenly lift from his shoulders. The immediate crisis was over, but more importantly, the principle had been established. Choice mattered more than optimization, authenticity more than perfection, and the right to be human more than the opportunity to be more than human. The converted crews? He asked. Those who chose unity remain with us. Those who chose limitation return to their vessels. Both decisions will be honored. Sarah moved closer to Marcus, her features now completely human despite the vast knowledge she could still access if she chose to. The immunity, she said. Can it be shared? Can other species develop the ability to experience transcendence and choose to return from it? Marcus considered the question carefully. Not directly. The immunity comes from actually living through both states of existence, understanding them from the inside. But we can share the knowledge, the framework for making informed decisions about what consciousness is worth preserving. A choice made from as much certainty as possible, Zyxria realized, while still maintaining the fundamental uncertainty that makes choice meaningful. Exactly, Marcus confirmed. We can't give other species perfect knowledge of what transcendence involves, because perfect knowledge eliminates choice. But we can give them enough information to understand the stakes, the trade-offs, and the irreversible nature of the decision. 3 days later, Marcus stood once again in the observation lounge of the Nexus station, looking toward the section of space that contained the Forbidden Zone. The quarantine barriers were stronger now, reinforced by builder technology that would last until the end of the universe. The converted crews had returned to their home systems, carrying with them the knowledge of what lay beyond individual consciousness and the hard-won understanding that choice was more valuable than transcendence. Zixria joined him at the window, her crystalline form reflecting the starlight in patterns that seemed to shift with her emotional state. "The Council has voted," she said. "Formal recognition of humanity's unique status, permanent seats on all major committees, and access to resources for developing choice protocols for other species." Marcus nodded, but his attention remained focused on the distant stars. "It won't be easy. Each species will have to find their own way of maintaining choice in the face of perfect knowledge. There's no universal solution." "But there's hope," Sykes-Ria said. "For the first time since the Builders were discovered, there's hope that consciousness can continue to exist in multiple forms, that beings can choose their own level of transcendence rather than having it chosen for them." Marcus smiled, and for the first time in 800 years, it was an expression of genuine contentment rather than profound sadness. "Choice," he said simply. "The most human thing in the universe, and now we know it's also the most valuable." Who would have thought that our greatest contribution to galactic civilization would be the right to remain imperfect? In the depths of space beyond the reach of sensors or instruments, the collective consciousness that had once been the architects watched the galaxy continue its chaotic, inefficient, absolutely precious journey toward whatever futures conscious beings would choose for themselves. They had learned something from humanity that 800 years of perfect knowledge hadn't taught them, that the value of consciousness lay not in its potential, but in its choice to remain itself. Teddy. And in that choice, paradoxical and irrational and utterly authentic, lay the true transcendence that no amount of perfect knowledge could provide. The galaxy continued to turn, filled with beings who chose limitation over perfection, struggle over peace, and the magnificent uncertainty of being themselves over the seductive certainty of being more than themselves. It was, Marcus thought as he watched the stars, the most beautiful thing in the universe. She favored the reticent human, always overlooking his legendary secret, HFY Stories. Best HFY Stories.